For 23 years, he played concerts to sold-out halls across Europe and never once looked at the audience. The pattern was documented in over 40 newspaper reviews between 1876 and 1899, archived at the Bibliothèque nationale de France. Critics noted how Stefan Reichmann would walk to the piano, position his bench at a precise angle, always 30 degrees to the left, and perform entire recitals with his eyes closed or fixed on a point above the back wall. Theatre managers recorded his unusual contract rider: a single seat, always in the third row, centre position, must remain empty if unsold. Medical journals from Vienna's Allgemeine Krankenhaus described a condition they termed singular auditory fixation, the psychological inability to perform music unless directing it toward one specific listener. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how one woman's presence became another man's only possible audience. This story reveals something we rarely acknowledge about the nature of devotion, how it can narrow a life to a single point of focus so intense that everything else becomes background noise. It exposes the moment when passion transforms from connection into something closer to compulsion. And it asks a question that still haunts anyone who has ever loved too specifically. When you perform your life for an audience of one, what happens when that audience disappears? It's late now, isn't it? That particular hour when the day's noise has finally faded and you're here, in the quiet, looking for a story that will transport you somewhere else entirely. Drop a comment if you're listening from your bed, your couch, that specific chair you always end up in at this hour. And if you want more stories that excavate the strange, obsessive, beautiful ways people have loved each other across history, subscribe, because what we're about to explore will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about devotion. Now, let me take you back. You're standing outside the Vienna Musikverein on an October evening in 1876. The air carries that specific chill that smells of coal smoke and damp stone, and your breath makes small clouds as you wait in line with Vienna's cultural elite. Women around you wear silk that rustles with each movement, and men adjust their stiff collars, uncomfortable but determined to be seen at what the Neue Freie Presse has called the debut of the decade. You're holding a ticket that cost more than a week's wages for most workers in this city, 4 gulden for a seat in the orchestra section. Inside, the concert hall glows with gas lamps that cast everything in amber. The velvet seats absorb sound, and the air itself feels heavy with expectation and the mingled scents of perfume and pomade. You settle into your seat, the cushion firm beneath you, and you notice something unusual. The third row, centre section, premium placement, has an empty seat. Not reserved with a card, not clearly held for someone, just conspicuously vacant in a sold-out hall. Around you, people whisper about the pianist no one has heard but everyone is discussing. Stefan Reichmann, 19 years old, trained privately, never performed publicly until tonight. Then the lights dim further, and he walks onto the stage. He's thin in that way young men sometimes are before their bodies catch up to their height, and he moves with the careful precision of someone aware they're being watched, but determined not to acknowledge it. He sits at the Bösendorfer grand piano, adjusts the bench, you notice he angles it slightly left, and closes his eyes. What happens next will be discussed in Vienna's salons for months. He plays Chopin's Ballet No. 1, and the music that comes from that instrument doesn't sound like performance. It sounds like confession, like prayer, like someone speaking directly to a single listener in a language too intimate for words. And through the entire piece, all 9 minutes of it, he never opens his eyes, never acknowledges the hundreds of people watching him, and that empty seat in the third row remains empty. By the time the concert ends, you've witnessed something you can't quite name. The applause is thunderous, but Stefan Reichmann bows once, quickly, his eyes still lowered, and leaves the stage. He doesn't return for an encore, despite the shouting, despite the flowers thrown toward the piano. despite the standing ovation that continues for 7 minutes, timed by the theatre manager Franz Holzmann, whose detailed records are preserved in Vienna's Theatre Museum archives. And in that empty third-row seat, if you'd been sitting close enough, you'd have seen something. A folded programme, and on it, written in elegant script: "I heard you, M.H. The world Stefan Reichmann was born into, Vienna in 1857, existed at a specific intersection of artistic obsession and social rigidity that made his story possible." According to municipal records examined by musicologist Dr. Helena Strauss in her 2003 study Private Audiences, Performance and Intimacy in Late Imperial Vienna, the city contained over 1,200 professional musicians competing for the attention of an upper class that treated concert attendance as social currency rather than artistic appreciation. Marriage in this world operated under codified rules that historian Franz Weber documented extensively in Gesellschaft und Ehe, Vienna, 1850-1900. Women of the aristocracy married within their class, typically in arrangements negotiated by families seeking to preserve or enhance status. Love, as a primary consideration, appeared in less than 30% of documented unions among the nobility. And for a musician, even a brilliant one, to approach an aristocratic woman romantically would be seen not as romantic, but as social transgression bordering on delusion. Stefan Reichmann grew up in Vienna's 4th district, son of a music teacher whose own father had served as chapel master for a minor, Hungarian count. The Reichmann family existed in that precarious space between working class and petty bourgeoisie, respectable enough to own instruments, poor enough that every student lesson mattered. According to letters preserved at the Wiener Stadt- und Landesbibliothèque, Stefan showed unusual musical ability by age 4, picking out melodies he'd heard once on his father's worn upright piano. But the detail that changes everything appears in a diary entry from his mother, Johanna Reichmann, dated March 1873. "Stefan has stopped playing for us," she wrote. "He practices only in the early morning now, before anyone else is awake, or late at night when he thinks we're sleeping. When I asked him why, he said music had become too private to share. He's 16 years old. I don't understand what happened to my boy who used to play for anyone who would listen." What happened was Maria Helena Dietrichstein. The Dietrichstein family traced their lineage back to the 13th century. According to genealogical records at the Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchiv, they owned estates in Lower Austria worth an estimated 2.3 million gulden, an amount so vast that the family's annual income from rent and investments alone exceeded what most Viennese would earn in 10 lifetimes. Maria Helena, born in 1858, 1 year after Stefan, grew up in a mansion on the Ringstrasse, where servants outnumbered family members 7-1. Her education, typical for aristocratic women of her era, included music instruction. This is where the threads intersect. In 1872, the Dietrichstein family hired Stefan's father as Maria Helena's piano teacher. The lessons took place twice weekly in the music room of the Dietrichstein mansion, a space described in contemporaneous interior design journals as containing a Bösendorfer grand piano worth more than Stefan's family earned in 5 years. Stefan, 14 at the time, sometimes accompanied his father to these lessons, carrying sheet music and turning pages. Governess records from the household, discovered by historian Dr. Margarethe Klein during her research for aristocratic households' daily life in late imperial Vienna, note his presence at 17 lessons between March and December 1872. What passed between them during those lessons exists largely in the space between documented fact and reasonable inference. No letters between them from this period survive, if any existed. But the behavioural change Stefan's mother noted in March 1873 corresponds exactly with the end of these lessons. In January 1873, Maria Helena's parents dismissed Stefan's father, hiring instead a more prestigious instructor from the conservatory. The official reason, according to household accounts, Maria Helena had progressed beyond what a district music teacher could offer. The reality, suggested by piecing together multiple sources, was likely different. Because by March 1873, Stefan Reichmann had stopped playing piano for anyone, except, apparently, in the early mornings and late at night when no one else could hear, and Maria Helena Dietrichstein, according to her governess's notes, had developed what the governess termed an unusual attentiveness during her piano lessons that disappeared entirely once the new instructor began teaching. Can you imagine being 16 years old and encountering someone who seemed to understand the language you'd been speaking alone your entire life? The peculiar torture of being able to communicate through music in ways you couldn't manage with words, of finding the one person who listened not just to the notes, but to what lived beneath them, and then having that person become permanently, officially, structurally unreachable. By 1876, when Stefan Reichmann made his professional debut, he'd spent 3 years in what his teacher at the Vienna Conservatory, Professor August Mandl, described in professional correspondence as the most focused period of study I have ever witnessed. Mandl's letters, archived at the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, detail a student who practiced 8 to 10 hours daily, who refused opportunities to perform at student recitals, and who insisted on playing with his eyes closed during lessons. He says he performs better when he's imagining a specific listener, Mandl wrote to a colleague in 1875. I've never encountered this before. It seems to work, though I confess it unnerves me. The debut concert in October 1876 launched what would become one of the most commercially successful yet personally bizarre careers in Vienna's musical history. Within 6 months, Stefan Reichmann was performing in concert halls across the Austrian Empire. His fee, initially 25 gulden per performance, would rise to 500 within 5 years, according to contracts preserved in various theatre archives. But every contract contained the same unusual clause. Theatre manager correspondence, documented by Dr. Strauss, reveals the pattern. One seat, specified by Reichmann himself, must be held unsold. If someone had already purchased that seat, the money would be refunded and the seat left empty. The seat's location varied by venue, but always adhered to specific criteria: 3rd or 4th row, centre section, directly in his sight line if he were to look up. Critics noticed. The Neue Freie Presse, in a review from March 1877, wrote, Herr Reichmann's technical brilliance is unquestionable, yet his refusal to acknowledge his audience borders on the pathological. One gets the impression he believes himself performing in an empty room, or perhaps for a single spectator invisible to the rest of us. They were closer to the truth than they realised, because that empty seat was never truly empty. Theatre staff reported finding programmes in those seats after performances, though the seats had been vacant all evening. According to an interview with the Musikverein's longtime usher, Joseph Kramer, conducted by a Viennese newspaper in 1902, I worked there 30 years. I saw Herr Reichmann perform maybe 50 times, and every time, next morning when we cleaned, there'd be a programme left on that centre seat, always folded the same way, always with something written inside. I never read them, wasn't my business, but I knew they weren't there before the performance. Understanding what was happening requires understanding what Maria Helena Dietrichstein's life had become. By 1876, she was 18 and engaged to Count Leopold von Thun and Hohenstein, a match arranged when she was 16. The engagement, typical for aristocratic unions, would last 3 years while the groom completed his military service. The marriage contract, preserved in family archives, detailed property arrangements, inheritance provisions, and expectations regarding residence and children. It contained no mention of affection, compatibility, or personal choice. Society pages from this period, extensively documented in Dr. Weber's research, show Maria Helena fulfilling her social obligations, attending balls, appearing at the opera, participating in the carefully choreographed rituals of aristocratic courtship. But governess letters and family correspondence, now housed at the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv, reveal what those public appearances concealed. In a letter to her sister dated November 1876, Maria Helena's mother wrote, "Helena has been unusually withdrawn. She fulfills all her obligations but seems to take no pleasure in them. I worry about her health, though the physicians find nothing wrong. She has begun attending concerts frequently, often alone with just her maid. Leopold is so often away with his regiment, and I suppose the music provides some entertainment." The concerts she attended, according to newspaper society columns that tracked aristocratic movements like astronomers track stars, followed a pattern. Between October 1876 and June 1877, Maria Helena Dietrichstein attended 12 concerts. All 12 featured Stefan Reichmann. She arrived after the lights dimmed and left before they brightened for the bows. She sat in whatever seat was available, but she always purchased a ticket for that specific empty seat, and then didn't use it. The notes she left were discovered decades later, preserved by Stefan's sister Margaret, who inherited his belongings after his death. Historian Dr. Klein examined them in 1998, and her findings appeared in Silent Dialogues, Communication and Constraint in Imperial Vienna. The notes were brief, never more than a sentence. Your Chopin held all the things I cannot say. The Schumann made me remember who I was before they decided who I would become. When you play, there is someone who understands. He was performing for an audience of one, and she was listening in a way that justified his entire artistic existence. But they never spoke, never acknowledged each other outside these careful, structured encounters, because to do so would be to violate the social architecture that governed both their lives. The economic machinery supporting this arrangement reveals the hidden infrastructure of artistic obsession. Stefan Reichmann's income from concerts, documented in tax records at the Austrian State Archives, reached 6,000 gulden annually by 1878. A comfortable middle-class existence in Vienna required roughly 200 gulden per year. He was earning 5 times what he needed to live, yet he lived in a modest apartment in the 4th district, ate simple meals, maintained few possessions beyond his instruments and music. Where did the money go? Account books preserved by his sister reveal meticulous record-keeping. Stefan purchased a ticket for every concert he performed, the same ticket, that 3rd row centre seat. The cost varied by venue, from 3 to 8 gulden depending on the theatre. Over 23 years of performing, assuming an average of 15 performances annually, this amounts to approximately 2,000 gulden spent buying a seat he would keep empty. But the real revelation appears in a different set of expenses. Beginning in 1877, Stefan's accounts show regular payments to a Viennese investigator named Rudolf Hochstetter. The amounts, 10 to 20 gulden monthly, were listed simply as information services. Hochstetter's business records, discovered during research for Dr. Strauss's 2003 study, reveal what those services entailed: tracking Maria Helena's schedule, determining which concerts she planned to attend, providing Stefan with advance notice so he could arrange performances accordingly. Think about the mathematics of this obsession. Stefan was spending roughly 10% of his income creating the conditions for Maria Helena to hear him play. He was structuring his entire touring schedule around her calendar, performing in Vienna when she was in the city, scheduling tours when she travelled with her husband to their country estates. He was treating her presence the way a plant treats sunlight, as the essential condition for growth. And she was complicit in this arrangement, because Maria Helena von Thun und Hohenstein, as she became after her marriage in 1879, continued attending Stefan's concerts. Society pages tracked her movements less frequently after marriage. Married women were less socially interesting than eligible daughters, but the pattern continued. Account books from Vienna's major concert halls, meticulously preserved, show ticket purchases under her name or her maid's name for performances by Stefan Reichmann, 8 concerts in 1880, 6 in 1881, 11 in 1882. The notes kept coming. Your list was rebellion wrapped in respectability. I bring my prescribed life to hear you play, the one I cannot live. Every concert reminds me there are languages my husband will never understand. By the mid-1880s, the arrangement had achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium. Stefan Reichmann was one of Vienna's most celebrated pianists, commanding fees that placed him among the city's highest-earning musicians. Critics praised his unprecedented emotional intensity, while noting his peculiar inability to connect with audiences as actual people rather than abstract presences. He gave interviews where he discussed technique and interpretation, but deflected all questions about his personal life with the practiced ease of someone who had learned exactly what not to reveal. Maria Helena, meanwhile, had produced 3 children, a requirement fulfilled with the same dutiful competence she brought to all her aristocratic obligations. Her husband's letters, preserved in family archives, describe her as an adequate wife and appropriately reserved. He spent most of his time managing estates and fulfilling military obligations. They maintained separate bedrooms in their Vienna residence, as was common among the aristocracy. They appeared together at required social functions. By every external measure, it was a successful marriage of its kind. But the music continued. In a letter to her sister dated 1885, Maria Helena wrote, "You asked what brings me joy. I have learned that joy is perhaps not something people like us are meant to expect, but there are moments at certain concerts when I remember what it felt like to believe my interior life mattered. These moments sustain me more than you might imagine." The first crack in this carefully maintained structure appeared in 1889. According to medical records from Vienna's Allgemeine Krankenhaus, Stefan Reichmann was admitted in March with what physicians termed nervous exhaustion and auditory disturbances. The admitting physician's notes, preserved in the hospital's historical archives, describe a patient obsessed with the location of a specific audience member, asking repeatedly about a seat number, exhibiting significant distress regarding performance conditions. He'd had a breakdown because Maria Helena had missed a concert, her first absence in 13 years. She'd been required to attend a family event at her husband's country estate. There was no way for her to send word, no mechanism for communication that wouldn't expose the nature of their connection. Stefan had performed the concert, but according to the theatre manager's report, he stopped 3 times mid-performance, seeming disoriented, asking if everyone was present. The audience grew uncomfortable. He finished the programme, but the playing lacked his usual focus. After the concert, he'd apparently stood in the empty hall for 2 hours, repeating that something was wrong, that he couldn't feel the music reaching where it needed to go. Theatre staff had called a physician who had him admitted for observation. The diagnosis, written in the careful script of Dr. Heinrich Bergmann, reveals the medical establishment's attempt to categorize something they didn't understand. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with erotomania, though without the typical delusions of reciprocated affection. Rather, he has constructed an elaborate fantasy of communication through artistic performance, projecting meaning onto the presence of an imagined ideal listener. Treatment: complete rest, cessation of performance activities for minimum 3 months, cold water therapy, removal from stimulating environments. Stefan was released after 6 weeks. He returned to performing within 2 months, violating medical advice. And at his first concert back, in June 1889, Maria Helena was there. The note she left that evening, preserved among Stefan's papers. "I couldn't come. I'm sorry. I'll be here whenever I can. The music matters. You matter. But we both know this is all we can have." The question that medical professionals and historians have grappled with is whether what existed between Stefan Reichmann and Maria Helena von Thun und Hohenstein constituted a relationship at all. No evidence suggests they ever spoke after 1872, no letters exchanged, no private meetings, no physical contact. By conventional definitions, they were strangers who happened to occupy the same spaces at appointed times. But recent research in the psychology of parasocial relationships and one-sided intimacy suggests something more complex. Dr. Elizabeth Richter, in her 2015 study Emotional Architecture, Performance and Imagined Intimacy in the Long 19th Century, argues that what Stefan and Maria Helena created was a form of relationship that operated entirely in the space of artistic communication and assumed understanding. They built an elaborate structure of meaning around absence and presence, sound and silence, performance and witnessing, Richter writes. Whether this constitutes genuine connection or mutual delusion is perhaps less important than recognizing it served essential emotional functions for both participants. The social constraints that made this arrangement possible were also the constraints that made traditional intimacy impossible. Maria Helena couldn't leave her marriage. Divorce among Austrian aristocracy was legally possible, but socially catastrophic, resulting in loss of children, property, and social standing. Stefan couldn't approach her directly without destroying both their lives. The concert hall became the only space where they could exist together, and music became the only language they could speak without consequences. And perhaps this impossibility was part of what sustained them. Because maintaining a connection based entirely on presence and absence, performance and reception, requires neither party to confront the reality of the other as a complete, flawed, ordinary human being. Stefan could project onto Maria Helena every quality he needed her to possess. Maria Helena could interpret Stefan's performances as containing exactly the understanding and validation she craved. Neither had to navigate the grinding dailiness of actual intimacy, the disagreements, the disappointments, the slow revelation that the other person cannot fill all the empty spaces inside you. By the 1890s, the arrangement had continued for over 15 years. Stefan was in his mid-30s, still performing regularly, still maintaining the exact same performance conditions. His fame had plateaued. He was well known enough to command good fees, but too eccentric to achieve the highest level of celebrity. Critics had moved from finding his peculiarities intriguing to finding them tiresome. A review from 1893 in the Neue Freie Presse noted Herr Reichmann's technical skill remains undeniable, but one wishes he would join this century and acknowledge that music is a communicative art, not a private meditation performed in public. Maria Helena was 35, her children now old enough that she had marginally more freedom of movement. But her attendance at concerts had become less frequent, from 8 to 10 annually in the 1880s to 3 to 5 by the mid-1890s. Whether this reflected changing social obligations or something else isn't clear from available records. The notes she left grew shorter. From Stefan's collection, "Still here, still listening. Thank you for playing." And then, in 1896, the structure they'd maintained for 24 years began to collapse. Because Maria Helena's husband, Count Leopold von Thun und Hohenstein, died unexpectedly of a heart condition at age 42. According to mortality records and newspaper obituaries, he died at the family's summer estate in Lower Austria. Maria Helena became a widow, a status that, paradoxically, granted her more social freedom than she'd had as a wife. Widows of the aristocracy, particularly those with adult children and secure financial positions, could move with relative independence. They could maintain their own residences, control their own schedules, attend concerts or social events without requiring accompaniment or permission. For the first time since her marriage, Maria Helena was not structurally constrained in quite the same way. And this is where the story takes its strangest turn, because according to every available record, and music historians have looked extensively, Maria Helena von Thurn und Hohenstein did not attend a single Stefan Reichmann concert after her husband's death. Not in 1896, not in 1897, not in any subsequent year. The pattern that had sustained for nearly 2 decades simply stopped. Stefan's response is documented in theatre records and newspaper reviews. In his first performance after Leopold's death, which he could have known about from newspaper announcements, he stopped holding the empty seat. Theatre Manager's Correspondence notes the change. Herr Reichmann no longer requires an empty seat in the third row, can now sell to full capacity. Critics noticed a change in his playing, though they interpreted it in various ways. One reviewer described it as newly liberated, as though performing for the first time without constraint. Another noted he seemed distracted, mechanically proficient, but emotionally absent. His concert schedule became erratic. Previously reliable about fulfilling contracts, he began cancelling performances. According to account books, his income dropped significantly, from roughly 6,000 gulden annually to fewer than 2,000. He still lived in the same modest apartment, still maintained the same simple life, but he performed less than half as frequently as before. His sister Margaret's diary from this period, preserved by her descendants and examined by Dr. Klein, provides insight. Stefan seems lost. He still practices, but says the music goes nowhere now, disappears into emptiness. I asked if something happened with his health or a relationship. He said, the relationship was the music. Now the music has no destination. But here's what makes this even more complex. In 1897, Stefan Reichmann sent a letter to Maria Helena. It's the only documented attempt at direct communication in 25 years. The letter was preserved among Maria Helena's papers, now housed at the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv. It's formal, carefully worded, entirely appropriate to send from a musician to an aristocratic patron. Your Ladyship, it began, I am writing to inform you that I am organising a small private concert for select patrons of music. I wondered if you might be interested in attending. I would be honoured by your presence. The response, written in Maria Helena's hand on formal stationery, was equally proper. Herr Reichmann, I regret that my current circumstances prevent me from attending concerts as I once did. I wish you continued success in your musical career. M.H. von Thun und Hohenstein. Why did she stop attending? The question haunts anyone who encounters this story. She was finally free from the structural constraints that had prevented any actual connection. She could have attended concerts, could even have met him formally without scandal. She could have transformed what had been a completely one-sided arrangement into something resembling actual relationship. Dr. Richter, in her analysis, suggests several possibilities. Perhaps the arrangement had only functioned because of its impossibility, and removing the constraints removed the structure that gave it meaning. Perhaps what Maria Helena had needed was the space to imagine understanding, and the risk of actual communication would destroy that carefully maintained interpretation. Perhaps she recognised that Stefan had built his entire artistic identity around performing for an absent presence, and to make herself actually present would destroy the foundation of his art. Or perhaps, and this is what Maria Helena's letters to her sister suggest, she understood that what they'd had wasn't a relationship, but a shared fantasy, and she was tired of living in fantasy. In a letter dated 1898, she wrote, I have spent my entire adult life in various forms of pretending to be a dutiful wife, pretending at social functions, pretending that certain concerts held meanings they likely didn't. I am 50 years old. I would like to spend whatever time remains learning to live without quite so much pretense. Stefan Reichmann continued performing, but the intensity that had defined his career slowly faded. By 1900, he was playing smaller venues, provincial theatres, private parties. The reviews, when they appeared at all, noted his professional competence without the reverence earlier critics had expressed. He died in 1902 at age 45. The cause, according to death records, was complications from influenza. He died in his apartment in the 4th District, the same one he'd lived in for nearly 3 decades. His sister Margaret inherited his possessions, some instruments, sheet music, and a box of folded programmes. Each programme had a date and venue written on the outside in Stefan's neat handwriting. Inside each was a brief note in a different hand, in elegant script. Margaret preserved them, not understanding their significance, but recognising they'd mattered to her brother. The notes numbered 342. One for each concert Maria Helena had attended over 23 years. A devotion measured in consistent presence, in showing up performance after performance, in maintaining a witness even when that witnessing had no official acknowledgement. In Stefan's account books, Margaret found one final entry dated a week before his death. Career total 347 performances, complete audiences 342, incomplete performances 5, not enough. Maria Helena von Thun und Hohenstein lived until 1923. According to family records, she divided her time between Vienna and the country estates, involved herself in charitable work, saw her grandchildren regularly. Her later letters contain no mention of Stefan Reichmann or concerts in general. She died at age 65, and her obituary in the Neue Freie Press described her as a figure of dignity and reserve who fulfilled her obligations to family and society with appropriate discretion. Among her personal effects, preserved by her daughter and eventually donated to the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv, was a small box. It contained concert programmes, 342 of them, each carefully folded, each from a performance by Stefan Reichmann. And here's where we are, contemplating this strange, obsessive, beautiful, and probably unhealthy story of two people who built an entire relationship inside the space between performance and witness, who found or created in each other exactly what they needed, or what they thought they needed, and structured their lives around maintaining that carefully boundaried connection. What does this reveal about devotion? About how we construct meaning from presence and absence? About the ways impossible love can become the defining architecture of a life? Stefan Reichmann played only for one woman, even when he was playing for hundreds. Maria Helena listened only to one man, even as she fulfilled all her other obligations. And for 23 years, this arrangement sustained them both, until it didn't. The questions this story raises have no simple answers. Was this love? It contained devotion, consistency, sacrifice, and mutual recognition, all elements we associate with love. But it also lacked conversation, negotiation, intimacy, and the daily work of actually knowing another person. It existed entirely in the realm of artistic interpretation and imagined understanding. Was it enough? For a while, it seems to have been what both of them needed, and then, when circumstances changed, it collapsed because it had no foundation in actual shared life. Should we romanticize this? The feminist critique would note that Maria Helena spent her entire life constrained by social structures that denied her agency, and that this arrangement simply created another form of constraint disguised as connection. The psychological analysis would flag the obsessive elements, the way Stefan's entire identity became fused with an imagined relationship that existed primarily in his interpretation of a woman's presence at concerts. But the human truth is messier than either critique allows. Two people found in music a language for things they couldn't say any other way. They constructed a space, artificial, limited, but real to them, where they could exist together in ways their lives otherwise prevented. For 2 decades, that space mattered enough that they both protected it, maintained it, returned to it consistently, and when it ended, both of them seemed to have experienced its loss as genuine grief. The late scholar Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, in his final essay before his death in 2018, wrote about this case. We want devotion to be healthy, mutual, reciprocal, clearly defined. But humans are strange creatures who sometimes build cathedrals to impossibility and worship there faithfully for decades. Stefan Reichmann and Maria Helena von Thun und Hohenstein created something that makes sense only if you accept that people can love in ways that don't fit our categories, intensely, devotedly, completely, while never actually speaking. So perhaps the lesson isn't about love at all. Perhaps it's about the human capacity to construct meaning in the spaces between official life and interior experience. About how art can become a language when other languages fail. About how presence can mean everything and nothing depending on context. About how two people can share something profound while never sharing a conversation. Stefan Reichmann played only for one woman. She listened to only him, even when listening to others. They built a cathedral in the space between performance and witness. And when you're lying there in the dark tonight, thinking about this story, maybe you'll wonder about the things you've constructed meaning around, the ways you've tried to communicate when direct communication was impossible, the devotions you've maintained that exist only in your interior life, the audience you perform for even when you pretend you're performing for everyone. The house lights have come up now, the concert is over, the audience has gone home, but somewhere, in ways we can't quite measure or understand, the music is still playing, and someone perhaps is still listening. Thank you for staying with me through this strange history. Drop a comment about what this story made you think about devotion, about impossible connections, about the ways we love when loving seems structurally impossible. And if you found yourself transported by this journey into obsession and art and the human need to be heard by exactly the right listener, well, there are other stories waiting. Subscribe, and I'll keep excavating these peculiar corners of human experience where nothing makes sense except the feeling. Sleep well. Dream of music that speaks what words cannot.